By April 1917, when the United States of America intervenes in the First World War, the conflict had descended into a very predictable symmetry. The way that the campaign unfolded in 1914 was not exactly as it had been imagined. And the result was that the Belgians slow the Germans down as they attempted to push toward Paris. After doing so, as a result of modern rifled breech-loading artillery and, of course, the introduction of the machine gun, German forces bogged down along a line just to the northeast of Paris and runs all the way down to the Swiss border. Because of modern artillery and the machine gun, the opposing sides begin to dig in.
This was the infantryman's home for about 4 years. We're at the bottom of an actual trench. Up there is death. Military technology had changed since the last wars. You had quick-firing artillery, you had belt-fed machine guns, and of course, repeating magazine rifles capable of great accuracy. The safest place for an infantryman was down here. Inside the trenches, they were lice-ridden. Rats were running everywhere, and often, especially for the Allies, it was wet. The Germans, when they seized the ground in 1914, backed off to take the high ground to look down at the Allies. During big offensives, Allied soldiers would go over the top, and it's over the top of that trench. Any offensive action that gets you above the ground was likely to result in heavy casualties.
Here you have the clash of tactics versus technology. You have linear tactics. You have old school field marshals like Haig and Roberts and the others that thought, one more push and we'll open a hole to Berlin. Just mass the men in columns and attack. The Germans, on the other hand, had dugouts that were 30, 50 feet below the surface of the earth. As soon as the shelling stopped, that was kind of the all-clear signal. They could easily run up, place their 08s, their 0815s on pre-established concrete mounts, and triangulated fields of defensive fire with water-cooled machine guns that had a rate of fire of 800 to 1,200 rounds a minute. It's lethality against linear tactics. It was insanity to send men into that.
Bombardment by artillery forces units to move by night, and then as they occupy positions by day when they can come under artillery observation, they have to dig in to protect themselves from that artillery. When you add to that then this new weapon, the devil's paintbrush, the machine gun, you suddenly see circumstances emerge where men have dug in, sheltering themselves from artillery. They then were trapped in circumstances where they couldn't move, and that's because if they did move by daylight hours, they could be brought under fire by machine guns.
Now, this was an incredibly effective defensive machine gun. It was mounted on a sled that weighed about 75 pounds. The gun weighed in excess of 50 pounds itself. This is not a mobile gun. The Germans issued 6 per battalion at the beginning of the war, and that number would just continue to increase. You could take a Maxim gun and set it to a specific piece of ground and deny that piece of ground to the enemy.
The MG08 machine gun was very reliable and effective because of the Maxim type operating system, because of water cooling, and the weapon had therefore the accuracy and range that was necessary to pin forces down. But the MG08 machine gun had a shortcoming, and that was the weapon just wasn't mobile. World War I was, of course, characterized by stalemate, by the static conditions of trench warfare, and therefore there was an emphasis on the part of the general staff on both sides of the trenches to break that static quagmire, by break the symmetry of trench warfare and return fluidity and mobility and maneuver warfare to the fighting forces.
By 1915, the Germans had realized that although they had this wonderful heavy machine gun for the defensive roles, that it's really not that easy to move in the trenches. So they developed what's known as the MG0815. It's still a water-cooled gun, but instead of being mounted on a sled mount, it simply has a small bipod halfway back right in front of the receiver, and it's got a shoulder stock. Otherwise, it's basically the same as the heavy machine gun, but with this, it takes far less crew, can be moved around fairly quickly. World War I in the Western Front really becomes an artilleryman's war. Besides the machine guns that are used right up front, you have masses of artillery, and it's an engineering marvel. Today, 100 years later, it's very obvious the size of these shell craters, what destruction they would do.
World War I, to me, from what I've read, has to be as close to what I would envision hell on earth to have been. Verdun is an amazing place. It's amazing that man could be that inhumane to man and have the whole world not just collapse into some kind of surreal anarchy. How are you, the little poilu, sitting in his trench waiting for the German onslaught, and then these guys come out of the woods with a flamethrower, wearing gas masks, neither of which you had ever seen or experienced before. You would have thought that the earth had opened up during that artillery barrage and the minions of Lucifer himself were loose upon the earth. How do you not just melt away?
On June 11, 1916, the men of the 3rd Company of the French 137th Infantry Regiment occupied a section of exposed trench here on this hilltop. They were under direct German observation, and they were therefore exposed to punishing artillery attack and then also attack by phosgene poison gas. The result was that by June 12th, 3rd Company had suffered 94 casualties out of 164 men in the company. In the aftermath of the Battle of Verdun, there was a monumental effort that was time-consuming, associated with recovering the remains of the almost 250,000 people who lost their lives on this battlefield. And it took time. And eventually, men came to this hilltop to recover the bodies that were known to be up here somewhere, belonging to the French 137th Infantry Regiment. And when they came to this hilltop, what they found was surprising, that along this filled-in area that had once been, in 1916, a trench line, they saw that it was all filled in with earth and that at regular intervals, the tips of rifle bayonets protruded out from the ground. And underneath each rifle bayonet, they found the remains of one French soldier, almost all of whom remain unidentified. This image became powerful and meaningful, and it remains to this day one of the more powerful symbols of the cost, the human cost, of the Battle of Verdun.
When you look at any conflict, you always see one side might be better armed than the other. And that might actually determine the outcome of the conflict was, who had the better guns. In the Great War, you had the 4 main combatants, the Germans, the French, the Americans, and the British, just on the one section of the Western Front. The Germans had the Gewehr 98, basically the Mauser perfected. It is the finest of all the Mauser rifles ever developed by Wilhelm and Paul Mauser.
It was chambered 8mm Mauser. It fed from a 5-round stripper clip. The gun had very good sights. It was robust. If it had a flaw, it's that it was too long. The Gewehr 98 was more than up to the conditions in France, the mud, the dirt, the filth. But in the close confines of trench fighting, once you're actually in the trench or once you're moving from shell hole to shell hole, you don't necessarily need a long infantry rifle. So you started seeing handguns fitted with shoulder stocks, in particular the artillery Luger, the long-barreled Luger fitted with the 32-round snail drum magazine sticking out the bottom. And you'd also see Mauser broom handles that have their own portable shoulder stock in their holster used in this role.
How were the guns used in the trenches? Mostly by officers and men participating in night raids, trench raids, which were basically intelligence gathering forays into the enemy's lines. Having a handgun sidearm was indispensable.
The human cost of the Battle of Verdun was astonishing. Between February 21st and December 19th, 1916, 700,000 casualties were sustained by both sides. Out of that number, 230,000 were killed in action. This is the largest French World War I cemetery, and it's the final resting place for 16,142 of the Frenchmen who came to Verdun in 1916 and never left. They were young and old, short and tall, Jewish, Christian. They were from all walks of French life, and they sacrificed their lives for their nation. 16,142 of them. This cemetery was inaugurated in 1923, but it didn't end there, and that's because the process of recovering the war dead from the battlefield here at Verdun went on for a very long period of time, and it sometimes involved the recovery of complete sets of remains, sometimes identified, sometimes unidentified. But then it also included the recovery of unidentifiable human body parts. While they were creating this cemetery, they maintained a pit on the hilltop above the property where they deposited these unidentifiable loose human body parts. And by the time that it was sealed, they believed that that pit might represent as many as 130,000 people, German and French. And so, in 1932, with financial assistance from the United States government, the Verdun or Douaumont ossuary was created just up there.